Welcome everyone. I'm doing another candidate profile today. Also, I'm putting a tweet in the chat. I want you guys to retweet it in order to get some attention from Tracy Bean's channel. I need her to help me hopefully expose the Rachel Maddow controversy with the defamation towards Bernie Sanders voters. So that's in general. I think the best way right now is to try to get the attention of some of these people through, retweets and getting attention that way. And that's not a controversy I'm going to be done with, because soon I'm going to be publishing another article following up the direct connection between TYT's Cenk Uygur as well as John Mattis, the worm inside the Bernie Sanders 2016 San Diego campaign. Anyway, so this is Peter Buttigieg. We're going to be doing this profile today. Not necessarily because I think Buttigieg is going to be a permanent contender in the race. In fact, it's possible that his star is probably going to fall pretty soon, simply because once the debates start, Buttigieg is going to be easy meat for some of the other candidates. But let's get into some of his personal history, and then I'll talk more about his viability at the end, because really this type of these profiles are about giving an honest and fair representation for as many candidates as possible. We might get to Beto soon, as well as, of course, some of the candidates I really want to cover: Eric Swalwell and Tim Ryan and Mike Gravel, especially, who is in fact included as a person in the contender slide in this debate. So he was born in 1982 in South Bend, Indiana. His mother was a nurse, Jennifer Montgomery, and his dad was an immigrant from Malta, Joseph Buttigieg. A lot of people are making fun of his name, calling it Booty Judge, and I think it's hilarious, especially given the fact that he always talks about being gay. Ha! Gay! And whatever, which if you're going to have a name like that and you're going to talk constantly about your sexuality, then don't get mad when people start making fun of you, which is something that when you're a presidential candidate, just expect people to use anything against you. He attended St. Joseph's High School, Harvard, and Oxford. I think his degree was in political science, I believe. His father was a Notre Dame professor specializing in literature, and he wrote the authoritative translation of Marxist Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. Now, for those of you that are a little less familiar with it, I know one of my viewers is Toxic Threads, or Alicia Clegg, and I think she's covered this before, but Antonio Gramsci is he's the godfather of what's called anarcho-communism, which is one of the more common deviations from I don't know deviations, but offshoots of Marxism that is in the U.S., especially among members of Antifa and some of the more, disorganized groups of Marxists in the U.S. So that's Antonio Gramsci's philosophy. I believe he's most connected to them, although I'm sure somebody who's one of the anarcho-communists will probably type some sort of testy response attacking, saying, well, Gramsci doesn't represent all of us. In reality, anarcho-communism is whatever everybody wants it to be. You know how it goes. Anyway, so he worked for ex-Secretary of Defense William Cohen's consulting firm and the 2004 Kerry presidential campaign. So there's a lot of people who are claiming that Buttigieg is a far left wacko and things like that. And I think some of the things he says are really ridiculous and off the wall. But from what I'm seeing, he's more of the type of person who is a farm-grown, establishment Democrat. Those people that are trying to claim, well, he's really hiding this radical past. I don't see it. I see that there were certain things that he published about the Bush administration that were, in retrospect, kind of ridiculous. And nowadays, with the Democrats basically, rehabilitating George Bush, I don't think he'd want them out there. And in fact, he would be the type of Democrat that would probably try to attract the neocon Bush Republicans. He served in the Naval Reserve in 2009 through 2017 in an intelligence role, and he actually served in Afghanistan. Forgot to put that in the slides. And what he said is that he unfortunately doesn't want to have to be in a situation where a crazy president like Donald Trump could send him back to Afghanistan. But he hasn't commented on the fact that of all the candidates right now, Donald Trump is the most forthcoming with his desire to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan and from across the Middle East. And in my opinion, that's one of the reasons that some of these candidates are going to be raked over the coals by the progressive wing, because the progressives are for sure in favor of withdrawing troops from war zones, and only a couple of them have really talked about it, specifically Tulsi Gabbard and Mike Gravel, of course. He ran for Indiana State Treasurer in 2010, losing to the incumbent Richard Murdoch. He was elected mayor of South Bend in 2011 and then reelected in 2015. He opposed the Indiana Senate Bill 101 that allowed for businesses to plead certain anti-discrimination laws, caused an undue burden on the owners. So this was a kind of a dense read, and I didn't really go that far into it. But essentially, what the Indiana state government decided was that yes, there would be consequences for businesses that are, or there's certain federal guidelines that are directed towards punishing businesses that discriminate against people. But in terms of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, there are certain businesses, of course, that would probably be especially targeted by them. You think of the Colorado Baker controversy with Jack Phillips. So essentially, what Indiana decided to do was to limit the amount of liability that could be brought against these businesses due to their religious beliefs. And what this was taken to be was a way to legalize discrimination against gay people. But in reality, I haven't seen, I could be wrong, and I'll also admit that I don't really care, but I haven't seen that Indiana has been especially seen as anti-gay in the past few years since it was passed. I think a lot of people are presupposing that if you legalize something that is kind of frowned upon by more liberal elements of society, that constantly you'll see people using this as it's the same way as conservatives, some religious conservatives, they think that if you legalize gambling, you're going to create a whole nation of gambling addicts and people in debt for gambling. But the truth is that the people who are inclined to gamble already were inclined to gamble. They would have done it illegally if they could. And the same would go for people who, you're not going to get people to give better service to gay customers just because you're going to try to punish them using the law. He also supported the auto bailout of 2009 through 2010, which, of course, bailed GM out. And he claimed erroneously, there's a link to this, that it was more than paid back by GM. Apparently, the government ended up losing millions of dollars on this, if you really think about it, although they did regain some of the money that was used in order to buy out GM. Another thing that he likes to talk about is that he can win in a red state area because he happens to be from South Bend, Indiana. Now, what's the most well-known institution in South Bend? Notre Dame University, which is, of course, a very devoutly Catholic university. But the thing is that a university town, even a Catholic university, is generally very liberal. Maybe some of the more religious people in the community are conservative, but I live, for example, not far from John Carroll University, which is Catholic. It's one of the most it's one of the oldest Catholic universities in the country, and this is still like the most liberal county in Ohio. In fact, I think we have 3 Catholic colleges just in my area, and it hasn't really meant anything. We have lots of Catholics living up here, and a lot of their institutions and schools are up here. But the conservatism doesn't really. There's no correlation between conservatism and Catholic schools and colleges. So, and I think that he's building off of the fact that Indiana has gone Republican for all of the presidential elections in the past 50 or so years, except for 2008 and I believe 1964. So he was also criticized for claiming that all lives matter in 2015 in response to controversy over tape recordings of a police shooting. So let's watch this clip and then I'll respond.
Oh, it's a ton. As Mayor Pete Buttigieg appears poised to make his run official, he's facing a bit of controversy. In 2015, he said, quote, there is no contradiction between respecting the risks that police officers take every day in order to protect this community and recognizing the need to overcome the biases implicit in a justice system that treats people from different backgrounds differently, even when they are accused of the same offenses. We need to take both those things seriously for the simple and profound reason that all lives matter. Today, he responded to criticism about using the phrase, all lives matter.
At that time, I was talking about a lot of issues around racial reconciliation in our community. What I did not understand at that time was that that phrase, just early into mid, especially 2015, was coming to be viewed as a sort of counter slogan to Black Lives Matter. And so this statement that seems very anodyne and something that's kind of nobody could be against actually wound up being used to devalue what the Black Lives Matter movement was telling us, which is what we needed to hear, because unfortunately it was not obvious to everybody that Black lives were being valued the same. And so that is the contribution of Black Lives Matter, and it's a reason why, since learning about how that phrase was being used to push back on that activism, I've stopped using it in that context.
All right, Caitlin, so is this the first real rough patch the mayor has had to navigate so far?
Well, I was just with him in that scrum this morning, and this came after he gave a speech to that conference, a largely African-American audience, saying that Black Lives Matter. He made that point very specifically in the context, too, of criminal justice reform and his own record in South Bend. Now, remember, just 4 weeks ago, Pete Buttigieg was really an unknown, a long shot candidate. He, with a difficult to pronounce last name that we're all starting to get used to now. He's raised $7 million in the first quarter. He's done a lot of viral interviews and a televised town hall. He's gained a lot of momentum, and he's expected to formally launch his presidency this month in South Bend. So this is now what it means to go from a long shot candidate to a really serious contender. Your record is going to be scrutinized. Every statement you've made in the past is going to be scrutinized, as we know. So this is a sign of him being taken seriously as a candidate. And perhaps that, even though he is young, that past statements, past comments will be looked at, and speaks to kind of how this all fits into the Democratic primary, which is heavily weighing these issues.
All right, the final question goes to Bob. There are those who have called this primary the I'm sorry primary because some of the candidates have apologized or clarified previous positions. Do you think voters see it that way, or is it just a big fuss?
Well, I think it's a big deal just because, I mean, the Democratic Party has moved left. They're highlighting, most Democrats are highlighting issues like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and reparations for slavery. The reparations on Capitol Hill, actually, that bill has momentum now. So I think, the candidates here, they have to appeal to the base. And I think you can also see a lot of focus on Joe Biden's vote for the Iraq War. So I do think that you've got to clean up this mess. And certainly Buttigieg is, as Caitlin said, we didn't know how to say his name a month ago, so he's having a good run. But that answer that he just gave, that was a long answer. When you're explaining, you're losing in politics. But he is now under scrutiny, but his campaign is really soaring. I mean, you look at someone like Elizabeth Warren, she struggled, and Buttigieg is on the rise.
All right, you got to be ready.
All right, so this is very recent news, and I'll talk a little bit more about the controversy and how that plays into his viability a little later in this video. But in terms of him soaring in the polls, let's go back for a second. So his current standing on Monday of this week was 14% in Iowa, 15% in New Hampshire, 8% in national polls. Why is that important? Okay, some people might say, well, that's not really that much. Well, when you look at the fact that Democrats in every primary, they get a proportion of the delegates, okay, after you reach a certain level, that could end up being a factor because at a convention, which could be contested when there's no clear person that has a majority, that person's votes can be kind of peddled and marketed to another candidate in order to garner certain treats. Okay, for example, if Pete Buttigieg was to get a third place finish, and the first place person was Bernie Sanders, and the second place person was, let's say, Joe Biden, or I don't know, Kamala Harris. Harris and Sanders would be competing for Buttigieg's delegates, and one of them might have to yield to him the vice presidency slot, and that's why it's so important. If he was to, now, of course, that's provided that he holds a lot of these voters and that this polling is correct and that he can come out of the Iowa caucus with 14%, because in Iowa, being that it is caucuses, people can be dragged over to other candidates because they're being, they're kind of being heckled and told, oh, come over to our side or whatever. So I would say his most important state in order to prove his viability would have to be New Hampshire, and then it would be Iowa. So then you have, he was a DNC chair candidate in 2016 running to replace Donna Brazile, who, of course, herself, she was just an interim chair replacing Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And his claim was that, being that he's a small town mayor, he's not connected to any of the big candidates that had been part of the failure of the DNC in 2016, especially the Clinton campaign, which he did endorse. He would be the person to give a fresh start, and he could kind of make the bridge between the Bernie wing and the establishment wing. He ended up earning only one vote. Here's a little video of what he was putting out as his main points.
I'm Pete Buttigieg, and I'm the mayor here in South Bend, Indiana. I got elected twice because we had an honest conversation about our hometown.
Okay, that guy that was walking with him is his dude, his husband. But
we faced
anyway.
The fact that our industrial economy was changing forever, and we found new ways for families to get ahead. Now, our city is growing faster than it has in years. Today, I see our party needing a fresh start as well. Right now, as Democrats, we are at our lowest level of national, state, and local influence in nearly a century. It's time to make a new plan for our future. I'm asking you to join me as I run for chair of the Democratic Party. And together, we will write a new turnaround story. We must be the party that defends our freedom from things like dishonest banking practices, student debt, and politically motivated restrictions on women's health care. And we have to be true to our moral foundation as the party of fairness in our economy and our democracy, from wages to voting rights. We are the true party for families, getting families a raise, resisting the attack on affordable health care, and standing up to politicians who want to break up families living in our country today. And we must always be the party of the future. The solutions for our party won't come from Washington. They'll come from our communities, across all of America's 50 states and territories. It's time for new leadership to deliver the fresh start our party needs. So much depends on getting this right. This is personal for me. I didn't just see Afghanistan on the news, I lived it, driving and guarding vehicles outside the wire. I could be ordered back to war by a reckless president. Obamacare isn't just about politics for me either. It's how my partner's mother manages to get the chemo she needs. This is about life on the ground, the effects of politics on real people. That's how our party needs to organize. South Bend turned around because we listened to each other. We faced our problems, and we got back to basics, delivering results on the ground day by day. That's what I want to do as chair of the Democratic Party, so we can get back to winning elections and protecting the values that define our party and the country we love.
All right, you saw that, and that's pretty much he's emphasizing the entire time. You know, he has his husband in the frame. Look, I think it does become at a certain point a good point for him. He'll say, well, why is it that everybody else gets to bring their wife into the frame or husband? If it's Kamala Harris actually has to hide her husband because a lot of the identitarians hated that she married a white guy. But the point is that Pete Buttigieg has been running basically on this whole notion that he's blazing a trail for gay people. And that's been one of the reasons that he's gotten into the news lately, because this month he started to claim that he has this issue with Mike Pence over him being gay. And everybody thinks that Mike Pence is like basically Jerry Falwell or something, even though, to my knowledge, Mike Pence basically doesn't talk about gay people anyway. Then he also accused Pence of becoming the cheerleader of the porn presidency, which is a pretty funny. I think it's hilarious that he's saying that, because most people don't care. And to be honest with you, I think most people don't even care about Mike Pence anyway. They like, Mike Pence is such a low key figure that almost everybody is ignoring him in favor of Donald Trump. That's one of the reasons I've criticized Pence for his statements on Venezuela. I've criticized Pence for his, some of his accession to all of this anti-environmental legislation, the stuff that has nothing to do with climate change, but more towards conservation. So Peter Buttigieg is trying to make him to be this anti-gay ogre. And in fact, the ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, appointed by Trump, has claimed that Buttigieg's comments are a hate hoax. So let's hear from both of them about this issue or non-issue, depending on how you look at it.
When I came out in 2015, it was for the simple reason that I was finally ready. I had been wrestling with my sexuality for years. And if I had not deployed to Afghanistan, I might never have found the courage to come out. So I knew when I did come home safely in 2014 that it was just going to be a matter of time. Inconveniently, that time came in the middle of my re-election campaign. It came while Mike Pence was governor of Indiana. And since there had never been an out-elected executive in our state, no one was sure what the effect would be on my future. Would people in our socially conservative community embrace me and continue to judge me based on the job that I did for them? Or would they turn on me, unable to look past the fact that who I was something they had been brought up to reject? There was only one way to find out for sure. So I wrote an op-ed for the newspaper, waited to see what would happen. And to make a very long story short, what happened was that re-election night where we got 80% of the vote. When I was younger, I would have done anything to not be gay. If you had offered me a pill to make me straight, I would have swallowed it before you had time to give me a sip of water. It was a hard thing to think about now. It's hard to face the truth that there were times in my life when if you had shown me exactly what it was inside me that made me gay, I would have cut it out with a knife. And the reason it's so awful to think about isn't just the knowledge that so many young people struggling to come to terms with their sexuality.
So he's going on and on and on about this. Meanwhile, get to the point. What does this have to do with Mike Pence?
Or their gender identity do just that. They harm themselves, figuratively or literally. But the real reason that it's so hard to think about is if I had the chance to do that, I would never have found my way to chastity. Thank God there was no pill. Thank God there was no knife. People talk about things like marriage equality as a moral issue. And it is certainly a moral issue as far as I'm concerned. It's a moral issue because being married to Chasten has made me a better human being. Because it has made me more compassionate, more understanding, more self-aware, and more decent. My marriage to Chasten has made me a better man. And yes, Mr. Vice President, it has moved me closer to God. I can tell you that if me being gay was a choice, it was a choice that was made far, far above my pay grade. And that's the thing I wish the Mike Pences of the world would understand. That if you got a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with my creator.
So this is Mike Pence's response.
In the news the last couple of days, you've got Mayor Pete Buttigieg is invoking your name to, I guess, highlight a conservative pushback to certain LGBT ideas or marriage equality and the like. Is that fair to use you as the boogeyman in terms of to point at you? And would you like to respond? I don't know if you've responded yet.
Well, look, I worked very closely with Mayor Pete when I was governor of the state of Indiana. We had a great working relationship, and he said some things that are critical of my Christian faith and about me personally, and he knows better. He knows me, but I get it. It's they got 19 people running for president on that side.
Have you evolved at all?
In a party that's sliding off to the left, and
I agree.
They're all competing with one another for how much more
since
liberal
the year
they can
2000,
be.
have you?
I get that.
The country's evolved to some extent, I think, on marriage equality, on gay rights. Have you? Would you say your views have evolved at all since then?
Look, the Supreme Court has made their decision.
So you accept it as law?
And when I was governor of Indiana, we fully implemented that decision in the law. But Joe, I have my Christian values. My family and I have a view of marriage that's informed by our faith, and we stand by that. But that doesn't mean that we're critical of anyone else who has a different point of view.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about his rivalries with some other people. So I've updated this a bit. You have the corporate centrists are his real rivals, in my opinion. And, then there'd be the identity politics people. So you have Hickenlooper, and who's toast, by the way. Kamala Harris is a major rival. You have Beto, who I think would be the most comparable person. Beto O'Rourke, the only difference between him and Pete Buttigieg is that Buttigieg happens to be gay. And I'm not even kidding. It's basically the same pattern that you see. Beto O'Rourke campaigned claiming that he would be able to defeat Ted Cruz in the reddest of red states, Texas. He came reasonably close for the standards of the media, which has gained him, I guess because of that, he's become a credible enough candidate in order to be able to be considered seriously, even though I think Beto's campaign is not going very well. Then, of course, you have Eric Swalwell, who is a complete joke. I don't think he's a threat to anyone. Amy Klobuchar, who is not really, she can't even get her campaign off the ground. And then you have the heavy hitter, Joe Biden, as well as Cory Booker, who I think is a real threat. So Joe Biden and Cory Booker are pretty much the two that were going to be the biggest threats to him from the center. Joe Biden, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and to some degree Beto O'Rourke, even though I believe at some point O'Rourke's entire campaign is going to short circuit and collapse. You have a new guy, Seth Moulton, is in the race. I don't really know if he's going to be a factor or not. I think at some point you start to suspect that some of these people are running in order to be able to raise money for maybe a Senate race or something. Let's say Elizabeth Warren was to win the nomination, okay? She would then possibly, if she was to win, then Seth Moulton would be a good person to campaign to fill her Senate seat. So this is kind of him building up money for that Senate campaign that would end up happening. So I don't think he's really that much of a threat. And then you have these borderline people who kind of straddle the centrist and progressive labels. You have Gillibrand and Jay Inslee. Those two are not really a threat. On the progressive end, right now you have 6 people who are what you would probably call progressives. You have Elizabeth Warren, who is making a bid to become relevant again by leading the charge to impeach Trump. You have Marianne Williamson, who I don't think is really going to go far, but she's certainly changed the conversation due to her reparations-based platform. You have Andrew Yang. Don't ever forget about Andrew Yang. I do hope to make a profile of him at some point. You have Tulsi Gabbard, of course, very distinguished place because of her anti-war views. And then you have Bernie Sanders and Mike Gravel. Bernie Sanders, of course, is right now, I believe, the front runner to win the nomination. His main challenge is from Joe Biden. But again, like I said, Pete Buttigieg, if he's able to maintain some of his voters now, or at least get a significant share in some of these races and remain relevant, he could snag the VP slot because for one thing, he would have a lot of delegates, and another thing, he would, by virtue of him being gay, he would be able to, kind of market that as a sales point, that he would be part of the diversity ticket. But yeah, I don't think Mike Gravel is really. He's even admitted that he's not really running for the nomination, but he's a very interesting candidate, and I hope to cover him soon as well. Then in terms of the minority vote, you still have Marianne Williamson and Kamala Harris. Already addressed that. Those two are both campaigning on the reparations line. Same thing with Julian Castro, who's more geared towards immigration. Her and Harris, by the way. And then Cory Booker, Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Bernie Sanders. Those are all the candidates that are really the ones gunning for the Hispanic vote as well as the black vote. Then the blue collar vote. Buttigieg is somebody who would be campaigning for that because he happens to be a Midwestern candidate. But will he really be successful at it? Because I think that the luster of him being from a blue-collar Midwestern state is going to wear off because people are going to start to notice, well, his dad was a professor at Notre Dame. He comes from an intellectual background. Now, his military record helps to bolster his credibility, but that's about it. So his main rivals there are Andrew Yang, who I think is going to attract a very interesting. People are really selling him short. Tim Ryan is right now trying to break into that field. I don't know if he's going to really succeed. Certainly nobody's paying attention to him here in Ohio, where he's from. And then you have Hickenlooper and Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders, I think, is certainly going to attract some of the blue-collar vote, especially the union members. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more about the viability of Pete Buttigieg. And we're going to frame it in the context of his feud with Mike Pence, as well as the Black Lives Matter controversy, and why I think that he will or will not be a viable candidate for the presidency or even for the vice presidency. So, of course, going by the sequence, you have in February Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire is second, and as well as Nevada. I think that it's very key for him to win a significant share of the vote in Iowa and New Hampshire. I don't think he's going to come in first place anywhere over there. Then you talk about in March. I think he does have a chance, maybe in Massachusetts to get some votes, maybe in Utah, which, by the way, Utah Democrats I think would possibly vote for him, even though there are a lot of Democratic Mormons in Utah. California, that's a good question. I don't know. So beyond that, I don't know if he's going to be in the race. Whereas with Sanders is the video I did about Sanders, I really went through the entire sequence of states because I think that Sanders will be a candidate through the end of the race. With Buttigieg, let's talk about the weaknesses right now. When he sets himself up for this feud with Mike Pence, it is, like I said, very much akin to Beto O'Rourke's feud with Ted Cruz. So O'Rourke was constantly trying to get more media attention by putting himself up as the anti-Ted Cruz, and ultimately Cruz still defeated him, but people were saying, well, if he can garner that many votes in Texas, well, how much stronger could he be for the rest of the country? Well, I think that we're seeing that appeal only goes so far, and O'Rourke is really struggling right now. Now with Buttigieg, he's trying to do the same thing on a national basis, and I don't know if this will really work in a place like Iowa or in New Hampshire, but he's certainly not letting it go. Then you factor in the whole issue of the Black Lives Matter controversy. If you remember in 2016, one of the other candidates for the Democratic nomination was Martin O'Malley. And O'Malley made a famous gaffe where he said all lives matter on a stage and eventually was forced to apologize for it. It's the same thing with Pete Buttigieg. And then you're going to see people going against him, trying to drag him further on that path because of the Black Lives Matter controversy, trying to get him to yield on issues like reparations. Now, yes, in some states, like Virginia, like especially the South, in South Carolina, one of the early states, in order to really have any impact, you have to win a lot of black voters. In the general election, any candidate that identifies with Black Lives Matter would be completely toast. And I'll explain why. Black Lives Matter has some support in the black community. It probably has a lot of support in the black activist and black media community. But if you look at really the people who are voters, the average voters, whether they are black or white, Black Lives Matter has lost its relevance as an organization for, over the past couple years. I live in a majority black area. Both my city and the county at large is majority black. And the BLM movement has really fizzled and gone nowhere. You never see them anywhere. Nobody talks about them. In fact, they've been superseded by a more general progressive movement over here, which is not even that powerful. And in many of these battleground states where you're going to see Republicans and Democrats kind of fight for the votes, especially in the Midwest, which is where he's trying to make a mark. For the Democrats, it doesn't really help to be identified with Black Lives Matter. But during the primary, it certainly does in many of these southern states or states where, Maryland, for example, where a lot of the voters who vote in the Democratic Party happen to be black. So I would say that Pete Buttigieg is not a very viable candidate at all. If you are a centrist in the Democratic Party, you're more likely to be attracted to a candidate who will be able to ignore those issues. And that's why, but for all of the flaws that people see in Joe Biden, he's generally seen as the person who's going to be able to gather the centrist vote and be able to use it at the convention in order to perhaps force all of these other candidates to give him their votes and win the nomination. So, yeah, I think Pete Buttigieg is really a flash in the pan right now. A lot of the predictions that I'm making are based on the assumption that he's able to hold a lot of these polling numbers, which, as you probably know, is not very likely in any presidential election, let alone this one. The best example I can make for why you shouldn't trust those is that in 2008, Rudy Giuliani was considered a front runner for much of the pre-election, buzz and everything. And he built most of his election on the idea that he would be able to win in Florida. And then the Florida primary came and he lost, and his campaign was completely over because he hadn't invested any resources into any of the other states. So that's about it. I want you guys to remember to retweet the Twitter tweet that I put in the chat, and try to help me, get some of our more important stories out. Also, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. When you like these videos, it does increase the probability that other people will see them. And also, I want you guys to subscribe to me on Minds.com. That's at Chef Leopard on Minds.com, as well as on BitChute, also Chef Leopard, and on Gab at Starscream85. And I'll talk to you later. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.